Guy, let's have a chat about the conversation that we had at the market today. You remember the topic that came up was something about the energy of some fluid in the brain. I don't remember the specifics of it, but the person we were speaking to was talking about how this fluid actually moves down the spine and all the way down to the pelvis area, passing through each of the 33 vertebrae. Are there 33 vertebrae?
She was telling the story,
right.
Not me.
So she was saying 33 vertebrae, and then how it, so it gets down to the pelvis, I think, must be the sacrum, then comes back up, she said, and then goes to the solar plexus and stays there for 3 days, and then gets resurrected back up to the brain, and how this is apparently according to this philosophy, school of thought, an explanation of the story of Jesus, as in and she said when it comes back up to the top it gets crucified, which is like expanded by tenfold or something like that. Yeah. Very interesting story, and I was interested in that as a metaphor or analogy or explanation of, or an alternative reading, I guess, of the story of Christ. I think anything like that it's interesting to me in terms of like a commentary on, one of the world's most major religions.
Yeah, and look, so in the first instance, there is an endless sea of stories like that in New Age spirituality.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Yeah.
And the point that has been made, central point in Vita Sapien is that, we're free to believe. Belief is something you fill in the vessel. Your spiritual beliefs is a vessel that can be filled with pretty much anything. But there's only a small number of belief systems that are ecologically sustainable. There's nothing
Absolutely.
ecologically sustainable about that particular story. And that particular story is just one of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of manifested stories in an entire ocean of fabricated stories. Okay? And so I guess the point that I have about it is, thanks for sharing, but like, so what? The ecosystem's collapsing. Can we talk about that? Can we talk about a spiritual philosophy that's actually going to help us with the primary challenge of civilization, which is that we are, through our human behavior, is rerunning the Permian extinction. It's going to take out most life on Earth. So spiritual philosophy, there's many of them. You can't say that they're right or wrong, because by definition they're based on belief.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So that's not the point, to try and say that it's wrong, but to sort of say, well, that's an interesting thing, but if you spend more time thinking about an ecologically sustainable spiritual philosophy and your behavior followed, then we might end up getting out of this mess rather than going down talking about that stuff.
Fair enough. So it sort of seems to me that schools of thought like that are intended to, or it sounds to me like they're, because I've sort of been exposed to many of these over the years, and it sounds that they're intended to further the individual's spiritual development and or physiological health development. But I guess like my take on that is we can actually go a long way as humans. We can go a long way towards restoring our well-being just by connecting with nature and by deepening our relationship with nature.
Yeah. And there's a whole field of science and practice around forest bathing. The Japanese do a lot of studies on forest bathing, because they've got all these people in the cities that's going crazy with all this, intense like city overwork, but they get out into the forest. There's a lot of research, not only in Japan but also in Korea. They lost a lot of forests after the Second World War.
Yeah.
Big efforts to replant forests as a part of this,
It's fairly popular in Northern Europe as well, isn't it?
Yeah, in fact, I was talking to a guy who's a PhD in religious studies who was doing a really interesting study out of Sweden, and was looking at the way that Swedish people and non-Swedish people interact with the forest. So the Swedes will go into the forest, and they won't take music with them, like some other people go, hey, you're in the forest, let's like have a party, you know. But they'll just go there and they'll just be in silent reverence, like a quiet contemplation, where others. And he was saying also that many Swedish people actually pay an annual subscription to the Christian church. It's like a state religion over there. Okay, but they don't actually go to the church for their spiritual enlightenment. They go to the forest for that.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was interesting. So, and the other thing as well is that most of what passes as this sort of new age spirituality, and a lot of what passes for the other, mainstream stuff, is really about how to make yourself feel better, right? Okay, so I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling vulnerable. Let's do some Buddhism. Let's do some of this stuff, or whatever it is. But what we really need to be doing is figuring out how can we have a spiritual philosophy that fosters us to do something good for the planet. And it's this two-way street, because in re-establishing the forest, you then have the forest in which you can get that relief. So I've been in.
So you're saying that if we put effort into sustaining, maintaining, or restoring nature or the planetary ecosystems, are you saying that that'll make us feel better?
Well, the actual practice of doing something that helps the planet makes people feel better. Right, about ecosystem collapse, because they're in action, but also in doing so, you've got this
I thought it was just
place.
me.
Yeah, so I was in France and involved in this event, and we were doing these slow walks in the morning by the river. And after about 10 days of slowly walking past all the trash by the path next to the river, I said, maybe we should do a slow walk where we actually pick up the trash, right? So rather than just seeing this spiritual practice as what's in it for me, right? Let's have a spiritual practice, whereas what's in it for the ecosystem, which is also a pathway of doing it for me, because the ecosystem is a life support system.
Well, what that brings to mind for me is that so many of the world's religious traditions, or spiritual traditions, include a major part of their, paradigm or framework is doing good for others, or doing good outside yourself. I guess. And as is stated in Vita Sapien's 6-point spiritual philosophy, the number one there is the golden rule, right? And the golden rule of most religions is to effectively to do unto others as you would have them to do unto you, right? But there's no reference to the ecosystem in there. So and remember, these come out of the axial age, just 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. There wasn't an ecological crisis back then. There wasn't an understanding of the Earth system back then. There wasn't an understanding that if we continue to extrapolate human growth and yada yada, that we'd eventually have a sustainability crisis. Of course, nature was a lot more abundant and certainly much more dominant.
And it was still dangerous.
True, in many ways.
So and so that sort of goes some way to explain why those mainstream and religious beliefs, many of which the New Age spirituality sort of feeds out of, it all came out of this period where the ecosystem just wasn't something that you talked about, and it was just sort of there. And as is pointed out in the latest of the pocketbooks, spirituality has been with humans for around 80,000 years, which says that there was, for most of the time that the Homo sapiens have been spiritualized, which is the term that I'm using to say, having had that cerebral awakening to have spirituality, for most of that time, it's been an ecosystem-based spirituality. Right? And then 10,000 years ago, there's this explosion of other ideas, probably in part driven by the fact that we were in different living arrangements, that we were now in cities and towns, and a lot of agriculture and different social structures. So our spirituality kind of like evolved to fit the social structure that we were in.
Right, okay. So do you mean that our lifestyles sort of became less embedded in the natural environment, or less dependent on the natural environment?
Well, we're all still completely dependent on the natural environment, right? So we still get our oxygen from the plants. Indirectly,
right? But from what my understanding is that up until about 10,000 years ago, then people would have been much more directly...
More hunter-gatherer, more like indigenous people that we had...
Right.
I mean, not all indigenous people are necessarily hunter-gatherer. There's degrees of agriculture within indigenous cultures. But I guess the point now is that theoretically you could live under a dome exploiting a gas reserve in order to desalinate water and have as much electricity as like grow fluid under the dome. You're not really a part of that global ecosystem. You've got your own little ecosystem.
Yeah.
So back then they were totally dependent on the ecosystem.
Yeah.
You know, they lived in it. It was right there.
Yeah.
And then 10,000 years ago we've got agriculture where we're actually dominating natural ecosystems to create our own, not even really ecosystems per se, because a wheat field doesn't really sustain itself as a wheat field. If you actually stop tending it, it will become something else, right?
Yeah.
So these food that comes from agriculture is not a natural part of an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And of course now we've got 8,000 million people, and vast stretches of the planet are actually given over to growing food. Because there's too many people to sustain off what would be a normal healthy ecosystem.
Sure, right.
And of course this is the crisis that we're in, is that most of that agriculture is actually kept going through petroleum-based fertilizers.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So if we're trying to get off fossil fuels, well, we've got to figure out a way to get off nitrogen-based fertilizers that come from fossil fuels.